This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 636 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Oh, what's up? Thanks for tuning in. Soccer fans, this season, FanDuel and Captain Morgan are teaming up to give you a one-of-a-kind soccer contest to spice up game day. Introducing the Captain Morgan Soccer Pick'em, a weekly fantasy contest that's entirely free to play. The contest is simple. All you have to do is answer 10 questions about Captain Morgan and that week's soccer matchup. People with the most correct answers will earn their share of cash prizes. Head over to FanDuel.com/freegame/Captain Morgan and spice up game day with a free shot at cash prizes every Saturday. No purchase necessary, 21 years or older to enter. Location restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See full terms at FanDuel.com. Let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @JeremyRuzas. It says, from a value standpoint, don't you have to go Kenneth Walker over the 5 to 7 top wide receivers at 102? As a dynasty manager, running backs are always valued more due to lack of supply. Looking at the top 3 running backs last year, how Javonte jumped without stellar production and ETN retained his value. Thanks. So my short answer to this is that it depends. My long answer is that I have a lot of data to back up why it depends. Last offseason, I did a study on how rookies appreciate in value. I utilized DynastyLeagueFootball.com's average draft position data, and I looked to see how rookies fared in startup ADP from their rookie season to their second season. That's episode 478, and can help a little bit with this question. But on that episode, the sample I was analyzing went back to 2014. That's how far back DLF's ADP goes. I found that 48% of running backs in the first round of rookie drafts saw an increase in ADP from one year to the next. That number was 55% at wide receiver. So just in terms of startup ADP and getting better year over year, wide receivers were better selections. And round 2 running backs ended up being better bets than round 2 wide receivers. The goal of that episode was to just look at how rookies appreciated in value versus their counterparts, and how a productive struggle startup build made a lot of sense as a result. This question isn't exactly asking that, because we're comparing rookies to rookies. We're comparing Kenneth Walker to the other wide receivers in this class. So let's dig into those numbers a little bit deeper, and this is new data that I haven't talked about yet. I looked at first round rookie draft ADP and compared it to DLF startup ADP. I compared that startup ADP from year 1 when those guys were rookies to year 2 when they were no longer rookies to see how they improved. When looking at the 20 biggest raw gainers in ADP, players who just improve their ADP most in terms of raw number, the demographic is 1 quarterback, 7 running backs, 2 tight ends, and 10 wide receivers. Now that doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot because there could have just been more wide receivers drafted in round 1 of rookie drafts, meaning they just have a higher chance to have more gainers. This also isn't talking about a player's ceiling, which I think is very important to this Kenneth Walker question. Really, that episode on how rookies appreciate in value just talked about very basic appreciation. It didn't talk about the degree of appreciation. First round wide receivers will appreciate at a slightly higher rate. They'll see their value increase more frequently than running backs. But that doesn't totally answer the question of ceiling, right? In other words, let's say that you had 20 running backs and 20 wide receivers in our sample. So 20 running backs and 20 wide receivers who were first round rookie draft picks. Let's pretend that of those 20 wide receivers, all 20 increased in value year over year. Their ADP got better. Meanwhile, only 10 running backs saw an increase in ADP. That doesn't necessarily mean that you want to get a wide receiver. There's just not enough information there. Because imagine a scenario where all of the wide receivers increase by just 1 spot in ADP, while all 10 running backs increase by over 50. You may still want to go running back because you're not gaining that much value with wide receivers. It doesn't really work that way, but it's important to distinguish floor from ceiling here. You can really just look at year 2 ADP of these first round rookie picks to help us answer the question of ceiling. Let's take all of the first round rookie draft players since 2014 and just see how many of them were top 24 picks in startup drafts the following season. So we're not necessarily looking at appreciation here. Though I will say, all but one of the players who ended up being a top 2 round pick the following year in startup drafts ended up appreciating in value. The only player who didn't was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, meaning he was a top 2 round pick as a rookie, and then he got worse, but he remained as a top 24 pick. He was still drafted in the first 2 rounds. Now, doing this method shows us that 45% of first-round rookie draft running backs made it as a top 2-round startup pick the following year. That number was just 28% at wide receiver. And when looking at first-round picks, so top 12 guys, you've got 21% at running back and 15% at wide receiver. To put this all another way, running backs are appreciating towards a higher ceiling. But more wide receivers are just naturally appreciating in value. If you look at round 3 and round 4 of startup drafts, you find a higher proportion of wide receivers than running backs. So like I said at the start of this question, it depends. I think Kenneth Walker deserves to be in the tier with the first round wide receivers from this draft. Because from a ceiling perspective, running backs have more ability than wide receivers do in Dynasty. But wide receivers also have better floors. They're technically safer long-term bets. So if you're rebuilding, this is why I always say, go after wide receivers. So the way that I see it is, sure, if you want to take Kenneth Walker there, be my guest. I still would prefer Drake London at the very least, but I'm not going to fight this idea. I do think that we should still be looking at the player himself. To me, Walker isn't as good of a prospect as the top 3 running backs from last year's class. There's the glaring issue in his profile that I've talked about plenty on this show. So you can't lose sight of the player himself when making that choice. But you're absolutely thinking of this in the right way. That Dynasty isn't just about the individual player, but also how that individual player will appreciate in value year over year. I just wish I liked Walker a little bit more than I do. He's a great player, but I'm still going with the non-Jahan Dotson first-round wide receivers over Walker, because the wide receivers are a very, very good group. And I can at least feel good about them appreciating in value, even if the ceiling isn't as insane as a running back ceiling. The next question is from Patreon, from @ghound1189. It says, "Hi JJ, loving the late round prospect guide. Thanks. Thanks for all your amazing work. Could you explain how to view draft capital delta? Any interesting takeaways you saw post-draft from this metric?" So draft capital delta is just how my model views a player versus where he was drafted, and it spits out a percentage. I'll run through a quick example. The database that I work off of uses players who either went to the combine or who were drafted. So undrafted players who didn't go to the combine, they're not in this database. When a player goes undrafted, he gets a particular number associated to him in the database. That's his draft capital. And all undrafted players, it's the exact same. And since so many players go undrafted, that number represents a lot of players in the database. That means that even if a player goes like pick 200, that's not necessarily a low pick within my model. Because there are so many players who went after 200, which consists of players who went undrafted. So what draft capital delta says is, okay, here's the percentile that pick 200 is in. And here's the percentile that the player's prospect score is in. Let's find the difference between those two numbers. The example that I use in the late round prospect guide, which you can get over on lateround.com, is with Darnell Mooney. Mooney went 173rd overall in the draft, and he had 54th percentile draft capital as a result. Remember, a lot of players go undrafted. But the model showed that Mooney was a 66th percentile prospect, meaning he was 12 points better in overall score than he was in terms of draft capital. So he had a positive draft capital delta, making him a potential value. Really, draft capital delta is looking at how the model views a player without necessarily factoring in draft capital. So because I know the inputs of the model are favorable for finding good players in fantasy football, then I also know that players with positive draft capital deltas are just generally better bets. But don't assume that a player with a positive draft capital delta is better than a player with a negative one. At the end of the day, a player's prospect score is the most important piece, and that includes draft capital. For example, this season, Isaiah Pacheco has a draft capital delta of about 10%, which is great. It's another reason I'm into him as a dart throw. Meanwhile, Dameon Pierce has a draft capital delta of minus 9% because he had a pretty incomplete production profile in college. But Pierce is significantly better than Pacheco in prospect score. He should be drafted ahead of him, 100%. It's just that Pacheco is an interesting player given it looks like he went underdrafted. In the guide, I lay out some examples of how it's been useful in the past. It's not nearly as predictive as the prospect score is, but it's at least something that we can use to help find glaring values. This next question is from @Impulsivity on Twitter. It says, a guy like Breece Hall would have gone much earlier in the NFL draft 5 years ago, but teams now correctly value running backs less. Does your model factor in positional shifts in draft capital? Or do you stick with the exact draft position because there's enough other variants to worry about? I also got another email from Dana that says, after being drafted, Breece Hall did an interview where he let slip the Jets had tried to trade back into the first round the night before to draft him, but were unsuccessful. Can you elaborate on how the model may have adjusted his scoring had that happened? Assuming a first round draft capital somewhere in the 30 to 32 range versus round 2 at 36. Does it really matter all that much? So look, I get questions like these all the time because I say that my model uses draft capital. It does use draft capital. It should use draft capital. It's a very helpful resource. And I think that they're very fair questions. But I think the questions usually exaggerate the narrative a little bit. I'm not sure teams have shifted that dramatically from their historical evaluation of running backs. I'm not talking about now versus 1970. I'm talking about now versus like 2010. We just have a small sample size that we're working off of in the current era of football. So all it takes is like 2 or 3 instances where a team does something really dumb at the position for us to think that that's how teams think. Like, let's just look at this at a high level. We didn't have any first round running backs this year when we had 2 last year. We had 1 in 2020, 1 in 2019, 3 in 2018, and 2 in 2017. In 2013 and in 2014, we didn't have a single first round running back pick. So if we drew the line at first round, I would say things really haven't been that much different. Maybe teams have finally realized they shouldn't spend top 5 or top 10 picks on the running back position. But let's not pretend that that's happened frequently. Or so frequently enough to drastically change a model. It only happened 6 times since 2011. And really, the hit rates of those running backs was really good for fantasy purposes. So these players probably should have been elevated. They probably should have looked better in a model because they were drafted so high. They ended up being very good in fantasy football. And I'm talking about Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey. It made sense that the model liked them for fantasy purposes. Now, I test the model every year and tweak things where it's necessary to tweak things. But I don't think it's necessary to drastically change things at running back, honestly. Not only that, but when I and others are utilizing this model, it's largely in a 1 or 2 year time frame. I use the model for my year 2 scores, and it can obviously help for rookies. But once players are in the NFL and playing, and I'm talking like 3 years in, we're generally only concerned about how they're doing in the NFL. Which means when we actually apply the model, we're doing it within a really short time frame. While I'm technically comparing Breece Hall to Leonard Fournette in this model to get a percentile score, the same exact thing is happening with the running backs in this class and the class before it. It's all relative. And there aren't enough data points at the top. There aren't enough Leonard Fournette or Ezekiel Elliott data points to really skew the data in a way where it's going to dramatically shift things or dramatically shift the way that we view a player. And then to the point about the Jets potentially getting Breece Hall in the first round but not being able to trade up, there's just no way that I can account for that. Because if I end up accounting for that with Breece Hall, I'd have to account for that with every other instance that happens, which would be impossible because we don't have that information. And we can't even confirm that information with the Jets. And look, it wouldn't change the bottom line about how I view Hall as a prospect, whether he was picked 36th overall or 30th overall. He was still going to look like an elite prospect in the model. Would first round draft capital have helped him? Yeah, of course. Not a ton, but it would do something. But we're using the model as a guide here. It's important to keep that in mind. This next question is from @Alex_Butler8. Why is Cordarrelle Patterson so low? Still not much competition for carries, has a running quarterback. I don't think he's great, but last year seems like a floor. Okay, so a couple things about this. Number one, remember that a running quarterback is not necessarily a good thing for a running back in fantasy football. I talked about that on episode 510, which was the impact mobile quarterbacks have on their teammates. Number two, I don't think last year was Patterson's floor at all. He's 31 years old, and last year was the first time in his career that he hit more than 64 rushes in a season. Were teams using him the wrong way? Probably. But it's hard to bank on a player that old seeing a ton of work. So we can't say that last year was his floor. With that being said, though, my early projections do seem to like Patterson more than the consensus does. Mostly because the team lacks playmakers. That gives him more of a touch ceiling. But don't sleep on Tyler Algier either. My model gave him a strong draft capital delta, and he had a 70th percentile score. That's not great, but he's definitely a real candidate to take over that backfield this year. He's got a 3-down skill set, and he compares favorably to James Conner. The The last question this week is from @Castle_Jeff. It says, how crazy am I for wanting to draft Skyy Moore over Chris Olave in the mid-first? I like Moore's landing spot better, and he's an early declare, but Olave is so much higher in your model. Yeah, Olave is higher in my model because he's objectively a better prospect in my eyes. It doesn't mean that Moore can't be better. I just think process-wise, Olave is better. Olave is coming from a huge Power 5 program where he played alongside stud wide receivers, and he was productive. Skyy Moore's best season yards per team pass attempt rate was 3.48 at Western Michigan as a junior. Chris Olave's was 3.24, so not that much worse, as a junior, while playing on a team with Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Jamison Williams. And Olave even missed one of Ohio State's 8 games that year. Olave went 11th overall, Skyy Moore went 54th overall. And like I said on the show earlier this week, the early declare stuff is not everything. It's just an input. We shouldn't use that solely to say if a player is good or not, especially because Olave himself didn't need that final season. Of course, the landing spot for Moore is better. I love Skyy Moore. I'm not trying to downplay Skyy Moore here. I'm trying to boost up Chris Olave. I've been talking Skyy Moore up for months. But the lack of Chris Olave love around the industry is absolutely wild to me. He's a very good prospect. From strictly a process standpoint, I don't think it makes sense to take a player like Moore over Olave, even though the situation is absolutely awesome for Skyy Moore. And remember, this is all about probability. When I say these things, I don't mean it's impossible for Skyy Moore to outscore Chris Olave or to have a better career. This is absolutely just a process thing. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Head over to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate your support this week, especially. Enjoy your weekend.